Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, but welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about how to securely connect your third-party vendors from your convenience store. We're very happy to have Simon Gamble from Mako Networks with us today. Next slide. I'll go through a few housekeeping items, and we'll talk a little bit more about Simon and his background, a little bit more about Conexxus, and then we'll have Simon give his presentation. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a little questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Just want to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available in approximately 7 days. You can find it on the Conexxus online subscription on YouTube, or you can go to conexxus.org, which is the Conexxus website, under resources and then webinars, and you can find this webinar plus previous webinars as well. You may obtain a copy of the slide deck, and that is upon completion of a survey. So approximately an hour or so after the webinar has concluded, you will receive an email with a survey link, and it's just very brief, very short. And once you complete the survey, then approximately an hour or two after that, you will receive another link to the slide deck. All participants are in listen-only mode, and so we do ask that you type your questions in the GoToWebinar panel in the section questions. You can just use the drop-down box and type them there. Please no vendor-specific questions. And if you should happen to need a certificate for PCI continuing education credits, please contact our host, which is Miss Allie Russell, which is arussell@conexxus.org. As I mentioned, Allie is our host today, and so Allie, thank you for coordinating and all that you do to help us with the monthly webinars here. I'm Cara Gunderson. I'm the chair of the Data Security Committee for Conexxus, and by day, I work at Citgo Petroleum. We're very happy to have Simon Gamble with us, who is the president and co-founder of Mako Networks. Simon, I think we were just talking that we've been doing this for probably about 4 years together, I think, or maybe even 5. And so tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, thanks, Cara. Well, my name's Simon Gamble. If you're wondering where the funky accent's from, it's from New Zealand, where we started Mako Networks many years ago. We're now a US headquartered company, and I'm based just out of Chicago, which is where our main US offices are. I've got a pretty strong background in networking security and computer networking in general, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some thoughts and ideas for how to better leverage some of the connectivity options that you've got today to benefit your C-stores.
Thanks, Simon. And just wanted to share a little bit about Conexxus because it's a great nonprofit organization. It's really member-driven. And it's when I say member-driven, I'm talking about the fact that it's really heavy in volunteers. So, for instance, Simon's a volunteer, I'm a volunteer. The staff is very small, and those volunteers are comprised of a lot of subject matter experts, such as Simon, and they set standards for data exchange, security, which is what Simon is here to talk to you about today. Certainly, mobile commerce. Conexxus, you'll find them very involved in the industry. They provide vision for emerging technology and trends. And like I said, you'll find Conexxus advocating and being a part of lots of other industries as well. So next slide. This is our webinar schedule. And as I mentioned, you can find the previous webinars at conexxus.org or go to YouTube. And next month, we have a step-by-step approach to automating security response in a multi-vendor environment. And so as you can see, there's a common theme here from all of these things is that a lot of times your security might be good, but you got to check on the third parties and check on your vendors and make sure that everybody that's coming in and information going out is secure. Want to thank the 2020 Diamond sponsors for Conexxus because without their support, we wouldn't be able to make some of these things possible. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Simon so he can talk to us a little bit more about how to securely connect our third-party vendors. Simon, thank you.
Thanks, Kara, and thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day to listen to me. Today's topic is about securely connecting to third-party vendors from your C-store. Once again, my name's Simon Gamble. I'm one of the co-founders of Mako Networks, and today I'm going to hopefully give you some things to think about when considering what third-party vendors to connect to from your stores and how best to do it. And hopefully it gives you some things to think about rather than just, I'm going to connect to this app or I'm going to connect to this service. So let's get started. Today, you've got so many options for adding functionality and convenience to your business, your employees, and your customers. Even just 10 years ago, the options were severely limited compared to what we all have to think about today for connecting to various third-party service providers. Now, by a third-party service provider, I'm really referring to anything and everything from a payment processor and a loyalty processor, all the way through to services that might monitor your CCTV systems, services that might allow for mobile payments in your store, services that might monitor the temperature of the fridges. All of these things are third-party services offered by third-party service providers. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what sort of things you need to consider when connecting to those services, because they're not just providing a service out of thin air, you're sending data from your stores to and from these service providers, and potentially accidentally to a lot of other places. Not all of the third-party service providers take security as seriously as they should. So really it's your responsibility as a business person to ensure you're not exposing your or your customers' data inadvertently to service providers or many other possible locations you could inadvertently send data. And I'll talk some more about that and build up a bit of a picture about things to be aware of as we go through. So as I mentioned, we've got so many options today to add convenience and features and functions to your store, but that wasn't the case even reasonably recently. The reason that all of these options have come about is because all of your technology is now connected via IP, and IP stands for Internet Protocol. And if a device on your network supports IP connectivity, either via Ethernet or Wi-Fi, you can get it talking to other services and other locations. And that's where all these third-party service providers have sprung up, because you can get data out of just about anything these days. Reasonably recently, the only things talking IP on your network would have been your point of sale system, sending and receiving payments and loyalty data to various hosts. Everything else was either not connected or maybe connected via some old legacy technology like Serial, which up until recently even your dispensers in the forecourt were using. Today, things have changed. In your point of sale network, you've likely got your point of sale and platform communicating the card data and loyalty. Your EMV dispensers are at least partially IP enabled if you've updated to EMV. You may be accepting mobile payments, which has data flowing all over the place to be able to work properly. You most likely accept stored value gift cards and other types of cards that are kind of not really credit cards, but there's important data flowing to and from your network about those cards. Your car wash is probably connected. Maybe you've even got license plate readers in your forecourt to spot known bad actors or to help streamline how fast your customers can buy gas from your locations. All of these things are connected in your point of sale network. But it's not just your point of sale network that's connected. You've got other areas of your business that probably have things connected that weren't connected 10 years ago. Maybe your phone system is using a voice over IP phone system. Your automatic tank gauge for monitoring your underground fuel tanks is probably connected these days. You might have media going to and from your dispensers to keep customers entertained while they're filling up their vehicles. You've probably got in-store music, which may be a simple radio, but more commonly these days, there's an in-store music service, and that's all streaming over IP. You might have your staff check in and out on time clocks. You might offer a customer Wi-Fi network. You've probably got temperature monitoring in your fridges and maybe ovens and things like that. There's lots and lots of devices, commonly called IoT or Internet of Things. It's really a catch-all phrase for all sorts of stuff that didn't used to be connected that now is. And oftentimes the surveillance video cameras are now IP enabled. Maybe they're not, but the head unit that records everything is, so you can watch your store's video surveillance when you're not in the store. So all these things are convenient, but you need to be thinking about what's going on with that data. So you've got all these things that potentially can communicate. Where do they need to communicate to? You need to be thinking about this with all of your devices. And what sort of benefit are you really getting from having them connected? Do they need to be connected? Your point of sale probably does. Your phone system certainly does. Your media probably does to get updated. All these devices, to really get benefit from being connected, typically need to connect to some sort of online third-party service provider. That's a lot of traffic going back and forth between all of your devices and various third-party service providers. The time clock management service, the music service, the automatic tank gauge monitoring service. They're all receiving data from devices in your stores and potentially reaching back into your stores to deliver their service. And depending on how you've got your network set up, all of these devices can potentially see each other and, because they're connected devices, communicate with one another. If someone were to get access to your time clock system, which you might not consider really needs to be overly secured, can they jump from that to your point of sale system and access card data? Think about all of these things and how these devices can chat to one another, both inside your network and outside your network. It's not just the point of sale system that needs to talk to the payments processor, the phone system that needs to talk to the PBX, the Wi-Fi that needs to talk to an outside service to generate customer analytics. ATG system needs to talk to an outside system so someone can make sure that a truck rolls and you fill up with gas before you run out. All of these systems, if not set up properly, can potentially communicate to one another. So think about security and take security seriously. This is your data and your customers' data that's potentially getting shared. If you do it properly, it's a wonderful thing. You get a lot of benefits and speed of service that you can send to you can create a better experience for your customers. But you need to consider what is connecting where and try and limit what needs to connect to just what needs to connect to deliver the service. And I'll talk some more about that soon. You need to consider what information is being exchanged. And I'll talk some more about that in a moment. Think about how the connection is being made. There's multiple ways that data can get from point A to point B. I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. Think about what else has access to the data. Notice I'm saying what else, not who else. Who comes from what, but what other devices in your network or in the third-party service provider's network potentially can see and access the data you're sending or receiving. I'll add some color around that in a moment. And then think about who has access to the configuration of your devices. I'll share some color on that soon too, but think about how your devices are configured, who has access to configuring them, and do they still work for you? So let's start by talking a bit about what's connecting to where. So in this example, we've got outbound communications. So when a device is communicating, where is the traffic initiating from? In terms of sending card data, the traffic's initiated from within your network and ultimately needs to get to the payment processor. This is a more secure way of communicating than externally originating traffic. So card data is obviously sensitive. Where is it connecting to? It's connecting to your payment host. Conversely, externally originating traffic might be coming into your network. You might have an automatic tank gauge monitoring service that needs to reach into your environment and talk to the automatic tank gauge on a regular basis so that it knows the level of your fuel tanks and the humidity in them, and even the temperature of the fuel can be reported back, and ultimately so your petroleum location stays full of gas to be able to sell to customers. But think about the direction of the traffic and where it's coming from. It's more dangerous if it's externally originating, because you want to make sure it's only the third-party service provider that you're buying the service from that has access into your environment. Think about what information is being exchanged to the third-party service provider. If you're processing payments, it's obviously credit card data, but it may also be loyalty data going to a location. How secure should that data be? How concerned about what someone could do with that data if they had access to it? Credit card data is more important and needs to be secured more than, say, an underground fuel tank level. Underground fuel tank level is going to impact. Worst thing that can happen is you run out of gas to sell to customers. You can deal with that in a couple of hours and get a truck out. If someone steals thousands of your customers' credit card information, that's more problematic for your business. But you need to consider what information is being sent and what someone could do to it and how that could impact your business if they got hold of it. The other thing you need to consider is, how is the connection being made? How does this, in this example, how does card data get to the payment host? Well, most of you are hopefully using some sort of VPN for that card data to talk to the payment host. And a VPN is a way of encrypting data, regardless of whether it's card data or whatever, from one location to another. Effectively, what it means is it gives you a virtually private network. It's like the credit card reader is directly connected into the payments host and bypassing all the stuff in the middle. If you don't have a VPN, that card data is going from point to point to point to your site controller, to your modem or firewall, across many hops in the internet until it gets to the payment host. So you need to consider how the connection is being made, which is going to dictate how the data is sent and how you care for that data. Do you encrypt it yourself before it goes through? Is the VPN handling it for you? What hops is the traffic making? With the internet, it's almost impossible to determine what hops the traffic is making once it leaves your network. So consider using a VPN to talk to your third-party service providers, because it eliminates so much more security concern that you might have to have. The traffic is effectively hopping over everything if you're using a VPN versus going from point to point to point if you're not. You should also consider what else has access to the data. So many retail locations today still have what's called a flat network. So a flat network is shown here. A flat network is when every one of the devices in your store is connected to the same network as all the other devices. That means all the devices on this network can potentially see all the traffic on this network. Why does your phone system need to see your point of sale environment? It doesn't. But many retailers still have networks set up like this, which is potentially very dangerous. And every major physical credit card breach in recent memory, from Target on downwards, has been able to be exploited because of networks similar to this. So flat networks are a pretty big no-no, because it means any other device has access to this data that you are sending to your third-party provider, or even if you're not, that data is effectively floating around your whole network. So if you've got a network like this, you should seriously consider changing it. It's made worse if you're allowing remote access into your stores. A lot of folks like the convenience of being able to remotely monitor the CCTV cameras in their locations. So from home or from other offices, you can see what's going on in your stores. If you're not using a VPN to get in, the most commonly used way is to allow inbound traffic to come in and see the cameras. And that might seem all well and good, but there's a few problems with this if you have your setup like this. One, anyone else can see your cameras potentially, and you're relying entirely on the security of your cameras versus your firewalls. So if you're allowing inbound traffic into, for example, a CCTV system, you're bypassing all the firewall security you had. And if you've got a flat network, you've then potentially exposed anyone who can get onto the camera environment can hop. They're inside your network and they can hop to other devices. So really think about this in terms of both if you are allowing remote access for your own purposes into your environments, but even worse if you're allowing remote access from a third-party service provider that's not over a VPN. It can expose you to problems you don't need to be exposed to. Think about who has access to configure your devices. You've got all sorts of devices in your network, everything from firewalls to point-of-sale systems, cameras, phones, customer Wi-Fi. Who can configure them? How are they configured? Who has usernames and passwords to log into them? Is it one person? Is it multiple people? All the devices need to be configured. Pretty much every device these days needs to be kept up to date as the vendors discover problems or add new features and functionality, or need to add security depth to the devices. Many devices you need to log into on a reasonably regular basis and click a button to start an update. Who's got access to that? Do these people still work for you? One of the biggest risks that businesses have is allowing multiple folks to have access to their systems and devices and then not cutting off their access when they leave. It can be a big risk to your business. So after this presentation, please have a think about who's got access to your devices and make sure they still work for you, and B, should have access to these devices. So that's a whole pile of security scariness. Where do you start? Sounds pretty complex. It doesn't have to be. The first thing as a retailer you should do is start by segmenting your network and setting controls. Go from having a network like this to having a network more like this. Think about what devices actually need to see each other and create appropriate security zones in your network. Your point of sale environment is probably the one you need to be most concerned about from a security perspective, because it can have such an adverse influence on your business if it's ever exploited or breached. So put the point of sale equipment in its own payment zone. Point of sale equipment typically does not need any internet access at all, so you can block that off. You can just allow the point of sale equipment to communicate with itself and allow it to access the payments and loyalty hosts, hopefully over a VPN, and nothing else. You might pay for high-speed remote support from your point of sale vendor. That's reached across a VPN too, not via the internet. So by segmenting this network, you can lock it down, effectively remove it from the internet, and ensure that it can only communicate where it needs to communicate. If you were to apply the same security protocols to your back office environment, you couldn't use it. The back office environment typically needs access to the internet. It might have some remote access requirements coming into it. Don't share it with your point of sale network. Your phone network falls into the same category. It absolutely needs access to the internet and to various PBX hosts and things. So put it on its own network. It doesn't need to talk to an ATG, doesn't need to talk to an online music player. So keep it separate. And certainly keep your customer Wi-Fi network, if you have one, separate from everything else. Obviously that network needs access to the internet for customers to be able to use it. And it probably needs access if you're analyzing what customers are coming into your stores and what they're doing. That needs to connect to a third-party service provider to get those features and functions delivered to you. But it doesn't need access to any other part of your store. You might have an organization or stores that are more complicated than this. So just think about how you can group things together. Most typical for C-store and petroleum retailers is having a point of sale network, a back office network, a phone network, a staff network, and an outdoor EMV network. If you have Wi-Fi for your customers, definitely keep that separate. It's probably the weakest link because you've got completely uncontrolled people and uncontrolled devices using your network. So if you've got customer Wi-Fi and you haven't got it separated, you should be doing that today. The next most important thing to do is review your setup regularly. Don't think of securing your environment as something you do once and then forget about. Things change. You'll add new services and functions into your environment. You might add a new device. You might be in the middle of changing to being able to accept outdoor EMV transactions. Your network is it's not fixed in time. It's changing. And you need to mark in your calendar, preferably every quarter, but in reality, any regular basis is better than none, looking at your setups, making sure that your devices are up to date, making sure that the firewall rules you have in place are appropriate for what you're trying to do today. Make a list of what risks you're bringing into the business. You might decide, look, I'm happy to allow access to my CCTV system because it's more important that I have access than not. But reassess that risk every year. Decide if you should be changing how you access your CCTV system to reduce risk each year or so if you have that issue. Reassess everything we spoke about today. Reassess who has access to your systems and should they. Maybe you've changed service providers. You need to get rid of their access. Certainly we'll be changing employees every now and again. Reassess their access. Review, review, review. It's really, really important. So, in summary, you really need to understand your store's environment. Have a think about what devices you've got in your network, where they need to connect, who you're connecting to get these services. If you don't understand your store's environment, no one else is going to. Work out your store communication requirements. So once you've worked out what devices you have in your store and how that network is laid out, work out where they need to communicate. Make a list of the third-party service providers that you're connecting to. Work out if you're connecting to them via a VPN or if the traffic is completely unencrypted. Change service providers if they don't take your security seriously. The buck really does stop with you to ensure that your data and your customers' data is being handled responsibly. If you think if the service provider isn't doing that, you should change them. Know who's got admin access to your devices. You can have the best security setup in the world, but if an untrustworthy person has access to change it whenever they feel like it, the likelihood is you're never going to know about it until it's too late. So keep the keys to the castle close. Know who's got admin access. Make sure that when you have a process that when an employee leaves your business, that their access is removed if they had anything that might be risky for them to have access to. And one thing I'd recommend is doing background checks on folks. It's cheap insurance, and people are usually the weakest link in security. You've probably all heard of phishing attacks, which is effectively social engineering. If you leave the doors open by having insecure firewall rules or an insecure network layout, that's one thing. But criminals are always trying to get valuable information, and C-store and petroleum locations have a lot of valuable information in the form of credit card data. It's often amazing how easily criminals get into businesses by just talking to someone over the telephone and pretending they're someone they're not. Make sure that you're as protected as you can be by not allowing your employees who don't need admin access to change things to have any access at all. So that was my wrap up of what to consider when connecting to third-party service providers in your environment. The key things that I'd really like everyone to consider are obviously how their store is laid out, what devices really need to communicate to where, and how are the devices communicating to a service provider. My contention is that a VPN is the best way to send traffic to and from an external party. And those VPNs can be built in multiple ways. The actual application that the service provider offers to you might form its own encrypted connection to them, or you might need to form a connection from your firewall or router device at your locations direct to the customer. But think about communications both internally and externally, and think about who has the ability to control those devices that in turn controls the flow of information. So now I'll pause and we'll open the floor to questions. I realize security can be a pretty dry topic. I've tried to make today's presentation a little briefer than normal, so that it's hopefully the few nuggets of information I've given you are worth thinking about rather than drown you in data and details. But having said that, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks, Simon. That was a lot of great information. And, you know, I think some folks kind of struggle as far as you gave some great ideas like how to get started. And so if they don't have the knowledge or even know how to do things themselves, who can they reach out to for some help?
It's a great question, Cara, and there's lots of options that they have. Conexxus itself is probably a great starting point. There's lots of managed network security service providers like Mako Networks and many others that are part of Conexxus and are really happy to help folks get their networks in shape and provide the experience that they've gained from dealing with thousands of organizations similar to the ones that the folks on this call have. So frankly, Conexxus is probably a great place to start.
Thanks. And like you said, you know, there's a lot of managed network service providers, and that is a new term that I think the point of sale vendors kind of created with as part of their new remote troubleshooting access that just happened to coincide with outdoor EMB. They're not the same thing, but nonetheless. So if anybody has questions, please do type them in the question panel of the GoTo webinar panel. And then I had another question for you, Simon, while people are typing their questions. But you had mentioned a VPN and VPN connections. How does that work? Do you have to establish a VPN between the device itself and the provider, or does that go between the firewall provider and the third-party service, or where does that actual connectivity lie typically, and where's the aggregating point?
Great question. I'm going to pop back in some slides and answer that with a picture. Hopefully I've got one in here that might work. So I'm going to show the segmented network because it's best practice, but there's a couple of different ways that can work, Cara. So if we pretend there is just hanging off the internet, a service provider, and you're sending data from devices in your network to that service provider. Where the encryption points begin and end is going to depend on the application. And by that, I mean, if we're talking about card data, the payments application on the point of sale system. If I'm talking about ATGs, the tank gauge monitoring application on the ATG device. Sometimes the application does the encryption for you. And effectively, it's encrypting data in itself, and then it's sending it through to the service provider, and the service provider unencrypts it at their end. And so that information hops over everything else, and it's encrypted from the device. That's becoming more common, but it's not as common as it should be or could be. So if your devices don't encrypt the data, then you form a VPN connection, typically from the edge device, from your firewall through to the service provider. And so the encryption starts when the traffic hits your firewall, and then it can only be unencrypted at the other end by the service provider. So it really depends if the application's capable of doing it, which probably 70% are not today. If not, you rely on the firewall to do the encryption as well.
Great. We had a question that asked what was the new term that I had just mentioned, and I had mentioned, I think what I mentioned was Managed Network Service Provider, or MNSP, and that is typically the firewall service and provider, much like Simon is. And Simon, if maybe you can elaborate on what the MNSP is.
Sure. So MNSP is a pretty generic term, Managed Network Service Provider. So that's an organization like Mako Networks, for example, that can manage your network for you. So it's providing a service by building your network environment in a way that is PCI compliant and best practice security. And the point of sale, two of the main point of sale vendors for petroleum have created a program called an MNSP program, which is designed to certify network service providers as being able to secure their point of sale systems to their satisfaction. So MNSP is a term that people often think about in terms of the two main point of sale vendors in the United States for petroleum, but it's really being able to provide any managed service to a customer. Kara was referring to it because it's really starting to be promoted in the C-store petroleum space in the US now, and pretty much all of the managed network service providers that work with Conexxus will also be certified by the point of sale vendors too. So it's likely that if you're using any one of the major point of sale systems, that your network service provider, like Mako, will be able to secure not just your network, but the point of sale system within it.
Great, great. We've had several more questions trickle in here. So if your network is segmented, but you have port forwarding on your DVR, on your cameras, is the DVR then in scope for PCI? And
No.
that might be a question for a QSA, but go ahead, Simon.
Yes, ultimately a QSA will give the definitive answer, but the short answer is no, or probably not. As long as the DVR is segmented from the point of sale system or any device that's got access to card data, you're probably okay. The segmentation does allow you to have port forwards coming into things. I still wouldn't recommend them. I think VPN access is much more secure, but if you're segmenting your network strictly in terms of PCI, you're probably okay.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits or maybe even the concerns of a TLS VPN versus an IPsec VPN to like the third-party service providers?
Sure. Now there's a couple of technical terms there, and to grossly oversimplify, typically a TLS VPN is a VPN formed by the application, and an IPsec VPN is typically a VPN formed by a firewall. Now that's not always the case. It's not the case with Mako, but typically that I think that's what the person asking the question is asking about. And a TLS VPN uses a digital certificate within the application to encrypt the data and for it to be able to be unencrypted by a device at the other end with a digital certificate on it also. PCI has defined the type of certificate that you have to use these days for that type of VPN to be acceptable to send card data. So in terms of a TLS VPN, you need to make sure that it's using an appropriate level of encryption. Most vendors these days meet that new standard. Some still don't. So you do have to, VPNs aren't the answer to everything. If you're using a good managed network service provider, they're going to ensure that the VPNs that you're using meet the PCI standard. If you've built some VPNs yourself and you're using old technology, there is a chance that the VPN is not encrypting things enough to be able to get you through a PCI audit. Yeah, I mean, I could go into a lot of detail on this, but I'm not sure it's super appropriate for this call. But if someone's got any more questions about it, I'm happy to answer if what I said isn't enough.
Sure. Are you seeing any new security features coming down the line, this year or even into next year?
There's always new security features coming down as the super expensive and unobtainable security features that are designed for massive enterprises start becoming available for smaller site locations. So I think next-gen firewall technologies are now beginning to become affordable for C-store and Petro retailers, leveraging technologies like intrusion detection and intrusion prevention are now pretty standard on the menu for a lot of firewall vendors for C-store petroleum locations. And they look at traffic more than just where it's coming from and where it's going. They look at the information within the traffic to determine, to be able to have a clearer security picture of, hey, this firewall rule is allowing this traffic in, but it looks weird, or it's coming from a place it normally doesn't. So IDS and IPS adds quite a big security benefit to your business, and I think we'll see more and more applications leveraging IDS, IPS. I think the way encryption works and the way VPNs are built is going to change and become even harder to break into. And both of those changes are really able to be utilized by C-store Petroleum due to firewalls and routers having more affordable and faster CPUs, because advanced security requires looking at information coming through the firewall in a fast and aggressive manner by the firewall to get information to determine if the traffic should be able to come through or not. But doing that, if the CPU is not fast enough, slows down the traffic, and you end up with a network grinding to a halt. So there's always a balance. So I think next-gen firewall features and functions that used to be the domain of large enterprises are now going to start seeping into the C-store Petroleum front this year.
Well, that's good that's coming, because there's just so many more threats, and with everything being connected, and my company certainly wants to know if I'm remoting in from home or remoting in from the Philippines or Malaysia or something like that 2 hours later. So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and IDS really does help with port forwarding. That's probably the most common place where it can assist a business. So there's been a bit of talk about allowing remote access to your CCTV systems. Well, you might have that firewall rule open, and if you are running IDS, your firewall might spot and block traffic coming from known bad actors. So IDS leverages information that's archived and databased in IDS service providers' environments, and you might have the firewall wide open, but there's a known exploit for your type of DVR, and the IDS system can spot someone trying to break that. And even though the firewall rule is open, the user trying to break your DVR will be blocked.
Yeah,
I think it's really exciting technology and really useful.
that is good. That is good. The next question we have is, with so many things moving to the cloud, you know, we're even moving away from you know, computing at site. We're moving it all to the cloud. Like, for instance, maybe a cloud-based back office. How do you make sure that the site's network does not get impacted, you know, from a security perspective with that cloud service?
It really boils down to the segmentation and what needs to talk to where. So, you know, I mentioned split the point of sale system off from everything else. The point of sale system doesn't need to talk to a back office cloud-based cloud provider. So think about what needs to talk where, and think about what cloud providers you're using. You do need to make a bit of an assessment as to whether the cloud provider takes security seriously. Ask them for some information on that. Ask the cloud provider what security services and things that they provide. Just because they've sold to a big company doesn't mean they take security seriously. Our company, for example, every third-party service provider, every cloud vendor, every service we want to utilize, we make the service provider answer a pretty in-depth set of questions from our security group to see if we want to connect to them. And there have been service providers that we've wanted to connect to for all sorts of valid business reasons that we just haven't, because we don't think the service provider takes security seriously after we lift up the covers. So you've got to look into them to see if they, you know, if they're dancing the dance. And you also need to think about what devices or people or whatever within your business need to access the service, and restrict only them to have access to it. Yeah. That's a great point. That, you know, PCI actually created a great document. I think the latest one was from March of 2016, but it still stands today, and that's called Third Party Security Assurance Guide. And that really helps you kind of make the decision and figure out how to vet your third party vendors, which is exactly what you're talking about today. And I realize that, you know, we know that PCI compliance is a data security minimum baseline, and that there's so much more that you could and should be doing. But it is a really good document and gives you some decision-making flow chart trees and things like that. But it's third-party security assurance guidance. And of course, it's free from PCISecurityStandards.org website. Yep.
So next one is, you know, when you're talking about third-party integration, what is your take on that provisioning or deployment process and ownership of that new system for data transmission? So, for example, the back office would it let the MSP work out the prescribed process to deploy new integrations, or would that be on the shoulders of the store operator to work out between the providers?
It's going to be a bit of both. So your MSP is going to be able to provide guidance based on experience and knowledge, but you as a business owner still clearly have a say, and ultimately the buck stops with the business owner. You can't contract yourself out of responsibility for security. So an MSP provider typically will have templates for how to secure access to various services, and oftentimes they'll have been pre-vetted by a QSA, so you know that the way the MSP wants to set up access to various parties is not going to impact your PCI stance. But if you're wanting to connect to like a non-standard or a new service that your MSP doesn't have any experience in, then the MSP is going to be able to come up with some suggestions about how to minimize risk. The most secure network is one that's not connected anywhere, but the reality is you can't work with that. It's useless. So it's always a balancing act between functionality, business use, and security risk. And ultimately, the business needs to decide what risk it's prepared to take. And the MSP is going to give you all the advice in the world, But ultimately, it usually comes down to the business owner's decision, because at the end of the day, they're paying the bills.
Right. Well, that dovetails into another question that we have, which is how should the merchant handle PCI DSS requirements 12.3.8 and 12.3.9 when allowing third-party access into a POS system? And I think most everybody on this call is pretty seasoned in PCI, knows that those are two complementary requirements. Basically, one says that the third-party vendor must have a written agreement for the services that they're providing the merchant, and conversely, the other one is just the opposite. The merchant must have a written agreement with the third party for the services that they're providing. You know, as a merchant, I like to go a step further and get the roles and responsibilities matrix, because that tells me very, very clearly, you know, step by step by step, and, you know, sub bullet point by sub bullet point by sub bullet point, what I'm responsible for and what they're taking responsibility for. I think that's about the only place to get a very clear delineation. You know, I don't think that attestation of compliance are clear enough and give enough information. But of course, you know, the report on compliance is certainly not going to be something that anybody gives up, because that obviously contains a secret sauce. So there's got to be a happy medium. So that's my take. I don't know, Simon, if you have something else that you'd like to add, but.
No, the roles and responsibility matrix, I mean, that's where it stops. So an MSP is going to use that as part of assessing whether a service provider you're wanting to connect to is doing things properly. So that roles and responsibility matrix is really important to both the end user, the business, but also the MSP when they're assessing service providers. So I think you hit the nail on the head, Kara.
Okay. We do have several more questions, but we are running out of time today. Probably the last one that I would throw out there is, does the underlying internet access provider, or does the internet access provider to a location need to be vetted in any way, or are there issues really at the firewall and third-party providers, meaning the internet service providers?
So from a security perspective, if you're using, you know, if you've got quality firewalls and are using a good MSP, the internet access provider really doesn't come into the security question. The biggest concern I think a retailer should have for their internet service provider is, are they reliable and are they delivering the service that I'm paying for in terms of speed and amount of data throughput? So short answer is no. Longer answer is there's other things you want to be looking at, but it's usually down to speed and reliability. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, that's about all we have time for today. If you would advance one more slide, I think we have some resource information there. And again, the website is conexxus.org. And if you do have any questions, please email info@conexxus.org, or check us out on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. So thank you very much, Simon, for sharing that great information today. And thanks everybody for attending, and we'll talk to you all next month.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day.